Hey everybody, this video is called Living for God, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Deuteronomy, where we're going to talk about living for God, being fully committed unto God. And Israel was called to be holy, and holy is to be separate, to live unto God. And so Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 1, it starts out, "You are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shave the front of your head for the dead." So Israel, in being holy, being separated, being set apart, they were commanded to be separate of the pagans. And the pagans might practice things like cutting themselves when they're mourning and everything. And the two practices were cutting the body and shaving the head. And these were associated with foreign religions, and it was customary for those different religions to practice cutting themselves when they're depressed or when they're grieving. And though the actions could be seen as innocent, they were associated with practices and beliefs that were disgraceful to the Lord. In many places in the Old Testament, they show us these practices were very common in these biblical times. In Isaiah chapter 3 verse 24, Isaiah chapter 15 verse 2, Isaiah chapter 22 verse 12, Jeremiah chapter 16 verse 6, Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 18, Amos chapter 8 verse 10, and Micah chapter 1 verse 16. They all show where people cut themselves. And in verse 2, it says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." So remember that this is speaking to Israel. Out of all the people on the earth, they were God's chosen people, and God treasured them with a special love. And again comes the important reminder of their special relation to God. And over 250 times in the Bible, Moses emphasized to Israel, "The Lord your God." And Israel was to be a separate people unto the Lord, and that is what it means to be holy. And they were chosen by God. They were his elect. They were his appointed ones. And Israel was selected out of all the nations on the globe. They were God's special treasure. In verse 3 through 21, we're going to read a big portion right here. And it says, "You shall not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals which you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the mountain goat, and the antelope, and the mountain sheep. And you may eat every animal with cloven hooves, having the hoofs split in the two parts, and that chews the cud among the animals. Nevertheless, of those that chew the cud, or have cloven hooves, you shall not eat, such as these: the camel, the hare, and the rock hyrax. For they chew the cud, but do not have cloven hooves. They are unclean for you. Also the swine is unclean for you, because it has cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud. You shall not eat their flesh, or touch their dead carcasses. These you may eat of all that are in the waters. You may eat all that have fins and scales, and whatever does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. It is unclean for you. All clean birds you may eat, but these you shall not eat: the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the red kite, the falcon, and the kite after their kinds, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after their kinds, the little owl, the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, the carrion vulture, the fisher cat, not the fisher cat, the fisher owl, the stork, the heron after its kind, and the hoopoi, and the bat. And every creeping thing that flies is unclean for you. They shall not be eaten. You may eat all clean birds. You may not or you shall not eat anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is within your gates, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So verses 3 through 21, we obviously see that it's speaking on the dietary laws once again. And you probably remember the dietary laws back from Leviticus. And so we see the summary of clean and unclean animals back from Leviticus chapter 11, more specifically, verses 2 through 23. And the ground for the allowances and prohibitions of the eating of certain animals was that Israel was to be holy to the Lord. You see, while the other nations and cultures might be eating these things, Israel was called to be set apart from them. And these special dietary laws were given to separate Israel from social mixing with pagan, idolatrous people. And this was to prevent them from being lured into idolatry. And eating the meat of an animal that had died of a natural death was prohibited, because the animal hadn't been killed in the proper fashion and the blood wasn't drained out properly. And the animal, however, could be eaten by an alien who was within the gates. And the prohibition no doubt reflected a common practice in the Canaanite religion that was irrational and observed that fertility and productivity would be increased. And we see that the chapter, Moses is reflected on mammals with the divided hoof and chewed its cud, and it could be eaten. And I'm sorry if you guys like camels, but camels would be considered unkosher. And for sea creatures, they must have both fins and scales to be kosher. So for my southern friends that love your catfish, shellfish such as clams, crabs, oysters, and lobsters, these were not kosher. And so I will eat my haddock and you guys can eat that stuff. But these laws, they had the purpose of keeping Israel healthy from diseases and potentially poisonous foods. You see, these laws weren't just made, to have a form of control. There was actually a reasoning behind it. God was protecting them from poisonings and other illnesses that can come off. And it's like right now, if I was to go eat a chicken raw, there's a risk of salmonella. Now we have the knowledge and the wisdom today on how to cook foods. In verse 21, I want to look at that again here. It said, you shall not eat anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is within your gates, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And not boiling a young goat in its mother's milk was a strange law, but it was a common pagan fertility ritual that was practiced. And rabbis, they take verse 21 and they interpret it as is that the Jews should not eat meat and milk in the same meal, or should not even be on the same plates with the same utensils cooked in the same pots, as the rabbis insist that the meat in the hamburger may come from the calf of the cow that just gave the milk for the cheese, and therefore that would cause the cheese and the milk to boil together in one stomach, and that would cause a violation of the law. But there was a different reasoning behind it. In verse 22 and 23, it says, you shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year, and you shall eat before the Lord your God in a place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil of the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So the tithe that is specified in these verses was that only of agricultural produce, which the land would provide. And this is the second tithe that was to be used in the celebration of the assembly of worship at the sanctuary, as you're going to see in the coming verses, in addition to the first tithe mentioned, the Levitical tithe, which went to support the priests and the Levites. And the Levites that served the people, as seen in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30 through 33. And a third welfare tithe was also offered every 3 years. And the tithe was to be taken to the central sanctuary, where the worshipers were to eat a portion in fellowship with the Lord. And the tithe was assessed on the income, not the assets. And the purpose of tithing was to build an honor and reverence for God, and it was to put God first in their lives. In verse 24 through 27 says, "But if the journey is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses, and you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink, for whatever your heart desires, you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you." So, if certain Israelites lived too far away from the sanctuary for it to be practical for them to carry their agricultural crops for their tithes there, then they could actually exchange the tithes locally for currency of silver, and subsequently convert the money back into substance at the sanctuary. And God made a way for them to be more conveniently to tithe. And we see, just like us today, in with churches and offerings and givings, and some people call it tithes, whatever. You probably notice a trend more in the churches that are getting more into technology, that there's many ways now that people can give to their church. They got the text to give. They got these kiosks that they put in the churches. They got where you can go on a church app and go under tithing and hit a couple buttons, and boom, you send out a payment and all that. Verse 28-29, it says, "At the end of every 3rd year you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year, and store it up within your gates. And the Levites, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all your work of your hand which you do." So verses 28 and 29 wraps up the chapter here. "And in the 3rd year, in the 6th year of the sabbatical cycle, rather than taking this tithe to the central sanctuary, it was instead stored up within the individual cities in the land. And this tithe was used to feed the Levites, and it was used to feed the orphans, the widows, and the stranger, the foreigners that lived among the Israelites. So to wrap up here, we looked at the commands to abstain from pagan burial customs. And as Christians, we don't and we should not be mourning the same way as someone who does not know Jesus Christ. And yes, we're going to grieve, but as a Christian, we can live with a hope that there is more than just this life right now. And losing Aiden at 10 years of age, there's nothing harder in loss and grief than losing a child, in my opinion, because I've been through it. And, I hold on to that hope through Aiden's profession of faith that I will see him again in heaven. And so we have the hope as Christians that we can be reunited with our loved ones down the road if they believed in Christ. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Don't be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope." And as Christians, we have hopes. We don't need to go cut ourselves. We don't need to cut our skin open and tattoo whatever through pagan customs. I'm not saying tattoos are pagan or any of that. I don't get into that whole debate with modern day tattoos. I believe that's a personal liberty type matter. But God gave the principles behind the command of separation. And Israel was to be a holy, separate people to the Lord. And the Israelites, they were chosen by the Lord to be his own special people out of all the people on the nations. And when you look at the word chosen in the Hebrew, baher, it means to select, to appoint. And they were his special treasure with glorious privileges. And guess what? Just as Israel was God's chosen people, specially treasured, so are we in the church, us New Testament Christians. And I want to go over to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. First Peter 2, verse 9, it says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light." So the Apostle Paul here speaking is saying you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And as Christians, we are also told in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, I believe it's 14, don't quote me exact verse, but the Apostle Paul says, "Be holy as I am holy." He quotes, what God has said. And so, as Christians, we are a holy people. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, we see that we are also a chosen people. And so, the word chosen in the Greek that was used here is ekletos, which means favorite, elect, and picked out. And, so God has chose his church before the foundation of the world, as Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4 and 5 tells us, that God has chosen those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. You can find that in Revelation 13:8 and Revelation 17, verse 8, that the names of those written before the foundation of the world are the ones in the Lamb's Book of Life. They will not be the ones to follow the beast. And Ephesians chapter 1, verse 18, I want to read that real quick. It says here, "The eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that you may know what is the hope of his calling, which are the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power toward us who believe, according to the working of his mighty power, which he worked in Christ when he raised them from the dead and seated him at his right hand in heavenly places, far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in that which is to come." So we are also a special treasure, as we are the inheritance of Christ. You see, the Father has given us to Christ, as John chapter 6 tells us. And Israel was commanded to be separate in regards to foods. They weren't to live like the world around them. And we looked at the command today to tithe addressed to Israel. And we saw that there was the option of long distance tithing, as it would be acceptable if somebody was very far away from the central sanctuary. So, in the long distance matter, a tithe could be exchanged, the agricultural crop could be exchanged for currency, and then the currency was later tithe when they went to the tabernacle. And we looked at the third year tithe, and that God blesses the given heart. And now in the New Testament, as I've covered this before, and I'm not going to hit on it too much, but the New Testament, nowhere does it command Christians to tithe. And in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 5 through 9, it clarifies that tithing was practiced and honored by God before the law of Moses. In the New Testament, it teaches that giving should be regular. It should be practiced among Christians. It should be planned, proportional, and giving in the New Testament is a private matter. And let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And that's gonna be our last verse that we look at today, I believe. And we'll look at verses 1 through 4. It says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me." So 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4 isn't speaking about tithing. It's speaking about a collection for Jerusalem. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and 7, to paraphrase, it says that giving should be generous and freely given, and that giving should be cheerful. And, so many people today, they get caught up with the tithe on giving, 10%. But realistically, 10% should be just a starting point for many people today. And some people, they may be able to give more with a bigger meaning, with a bigger sacrifice over 10%. Likewise, someone that's barely getting by, living off ramen noodles, having different life challenges that are out of their control, they might not be able to give 10%. They might be able to give 5%, and that would be a generous donation on their part. And that's going to wrap up this video, as we're going to look at next the laws regarding the poor, and we're going to be doing that on Saturday. So I hope you have a great rest of your week. God bless, and we'll see you Saturday.